Welcome back to #Lawyered. Today we have part one of a two-part episode covering the storming of the Capitol. In today's episode, we're going to explore the criminal implications of the protesters and the people that stormed the Capitol that day and explore what possible consequences they could face. Welcome back to #Lawyer, everybody. New year, same podcast, new episodes, I guess.
New episodes, but not really new you.
Yeah, that's true.
You still have the beard.
Still got the beard.
You still have that. Is this like a permanent fixture now?
I don't know. Kind of letting it kind of ride.
Okay.
We'll just see where it goes.
We'll
see where it goes.
Yeah, I'll be interested to see if this stays in place when we go back to in-person court hearings.
I think summer is the more thing I'm concerned about, the heat and how comfortable this is going to be when it gets hot.
I can't say I would understand.
Yeah, for sure. Well, we got something kind of special these next 2 weeks. It's a two-part episode. I mean, we can't, we were talking off air with Matt. I mean, we can't not discuss some of the legal implications of what's gone on.
And I was about to say, shout out to Matt for actually giving us the idea to really go in depth about this and talk about it.
Yeah, we actually got to give Matt most of the credit for the content.
Yeah, this is all his idea for this week and next week.
Yeah, gave us a lot of the questions, a lot of things we're going to explore. And as a little bit of a preview, today we're going to talk about the criminal implications, possible criminal implications of what happened in our nation's capital. And then next week we're going to talk about the First Amendment implications and everything that went on with that.
You know, I love civil liberties, y'all.
Right. And it's those are the two biggest questions I hear most people asking about.
Sure.
And there's a lot of political things to talk about too. And we're going to share a little bit of our views on that today. But really, we're focusing in on, okay, this happened and what are the consequences and what should we learn from this as far as the criminal aspect and the First Amendment is concerned.
Absolutely.
And, unless you were living under a rock last week, everybody kind of knows what happens, but just happened. But let's just to recap.
Or taking care of a puppy, 8
That's
weeks.
True. That's
Hi,
true.
Guys.
That's also another preview of an upcoming episode. We're going to have Andrea's new puppy in as a guest.
That's the goal as soon as she's not peeing on the carpet.
That's a good point. Matt will probably appreciate that. But just to jump into kind of what happened, to give a little background fact, we had thousands of President Trump supporters that went to the nation's capital on Wednesday last week in January to protest the certification of the election results. Protesters congregated outside of the Capitol building while the Senate was in session. Despite Capitol Police efforts to quell the crowd, the mob overran the police, stormed the Capitol building. This ended up stopping the certification from occurring. Eventually they were able to come back and do it. But in the meantime, there's been a lot of images we've seen in the news on social media of people taking Capitol building property.
Yeah, like the podium, right? That Speaker Pelosi uses.
Right. Government property.
Yeah, government property. I think it wound up on eBay, according to my little sister.
Really?
I have not fact-checked yet. So whoever did that, you're an idiot because it's easy to trace.
Yeah, no, for sure. And we also see, stealing Capitol property, standing in the House chambers, people going into, people's desks, congressional members' desks.
Yeah.
There was, there were, as I've read up now, there's been 5 deaths associated with what happened that day.
Yeah, and one was pretty violent. I mean, I heard that several were due to independent medical issues, right? Okay. But one was a direct result of the raid, if you will. And a woman was shot in the chest multiple times, I believe, during this raid on the during the raid on the Capitol building. And I hear that and I'm like, my gosh, this was all completely avoidable.
Yeah. No, I agree. And honestly, again, we're going to talk about the criminal charges. We're going to get into some of that here in a second. I do think part of the reason we do this show is we get to talk about how we feel about certain things.
Yeah.
And we get to, it's podcasts. We don't have to be unbiased, and that's kind of what I like about it.
Well, we have to be unbiased about the law.
Oh, right. But I mean, we can still share our opinions about whether we think the law is good or bad or
effective.
Right. And so I'm going to just ask you point blank, what are your thoughts about what happened last week?
Well, I think, first of all, the idea of your First Amendment right to peacefully protest, to march, and to picket, and to communicate your political displeasure or otherwise, okay, that is an area of law that is just shrouded with sanctity.
Right.
That is one of the founding principles of our entire government. However, as we're going to get into next week, there are certain types of free speech that are not protected, okay? And speech that incites violence is not protected. And then going and breaking into the Capitol building, stealing things, creating an environment where people literally died, that is reckless, that is irresponsible, You have gone from doing exactly what a good citizen should do, which is protest and make your political opinions heard in a peaceful way, to being absolutely mob rule. Like, what do you think you are? Like gladiators? Like that? No, that's absolutely ridiculous. And frankly, you know, I had a family member who said that he really wanted to go to the protest in DC and peacefully show his support for Trump. And I was like, you know what? That's your decision. That's your call. I would be a little concerned for your safety, coronavirus and everything. I had no idea something like this would happen.
Right, you were concerned about
wearing
coronavirus. Masks and not necessarily, the militia overthrowing, trying to do the coup d'etat of the
And
US
so
government.
I was shocked. And so that, you know, that family member eventually decided that, you know, well, you know, with coronavirus, maybe it's, and given the age, you know, maybe it was better that that family member didn't go. And when I was hearing about the riots, all I could think of was literally, thank God, and I mean that in the most sincere sense possible, because I would have been worried sick about my family member if he were there.
Sure.
Because, I mean, I don't want him getting pushed around and trampled. I mean, things happen when mobs occur. You have mob mentality. People get trampled and run over. Some woman got shot.
Right.
You could have been standing there peacefully, and then you could have been, like, seriously injured. And the whole thing is just ridiculous, and it is comical in the least funny way possible. I mean, it's just an embarrassment.
I agree.
It is complete embarrassment. And also, now I'm going to get off my soapbox in 1 minute, but I think the fact that this is the first time the Capitol building has been stormed since the British invaded in 1814 and burned the Capitol building to the ground says a whole heck of a lot.
I agree.
Yeah.
I think it says a heck of a lot about society, where we are right now, our country, and how polarizing everybody is. I think it says a lot about, and I have no qualms sharing my personal beliefs. I think it says a lot about the message that our outgoing president has been sending to people. And, you know, I think you mentioned something a second ago about the sanctity of the First Amendment. And again, we can't talk today about the criminal aspect without at least mentioning the First Amendment, even though we're talking about it next week. But the sanctity of it is the right to peaceably assemble. It's the whole idea.
Peacefully assemble, peacefully protest, engage in free speech, right?
Yeah.
Because you're engaging in the marketplace of ideas and communicating. I mean, free speech is fundamental for a free society.
Right.
Okay. That does not give you a license for violence.
Well, and our government still has to function. You know,
absolutely, our government still has to function.
There was a process in place, and prior to the storming of the Capitol building, there were some speeches made by certain senators about we need to think about how we're certifying this, and there were senators that were against certifying the results.
I think there were approximately 7, including our Texas senator,
right,
Mr. Cruz.
And regardless of your opinion on that, that's the process that's put in place. That was put in place by our founding fathers. That's the reason it's there. We didn't need a mob to come in and fix the situation for us.
Correct. And you know what? And here's my take on that. The senators who were protesting or who didn't protest, they were just participating, like you said, in the process that was put forth in the Constitution, which I think, again, I forgot to fact check this last time. I do think that the process with the Electoral College and recertifying certain states' votes, I think that whole system was overhauled, but I would need to check again. But anyway.
But it's in place now.
It's in place now.
And there's a reason it's in place.
Yeah. And there's a process, right? That is the law, right? So they were doing the legally correct thing, given the situation. And whatever side they fell on, I can't fault them for it because they were expressing what hopefully were their constituents' views in this process. And now if the mob had come and they had left the, Save America rally that Trump was holding within apparently walking distance of the Capitol, if they had just gone and stood outside the Capitol and peacefully picketed and chanted, maybe not hang Mike Pence, which I heard they were at one point chanting during the rally.
I did hear about that too, yeah.
That's not cool, but if they had been chanting something like, object, object, object to the recertification. Okay, that's fine. But standing peacefully, not doing anything violent.
Right.
That's fine. Go for it. I think that's great. You are exercising your right to peacefully assemble and to protest. That is what this country is built on. But the minute they start storming Capitol buildings, start, encouraging in violence with the police, and then stealing stuff from the Capitol, who do you think you are? Yeah. You are an embarrassment to the country by doing that. You are embarrassing our representatives, you're embarrassing our system of elections, and you are embarrassing yourselves, and you're embarrassing frankly, the Republican Party. Now, full disclosure, I don't identify as Republican or Democrat personally, but I'm just saying, if someone who said, oh, I represent Andrea's political viewpoints, went and did that, I would say you're an embarrassment to me.
Yeah.
Now, if you had just stayed outside and peacefully protested, I would say, great, I'm proud of you.
Right. Well, that's the whole deal. You're allowed to share your views until it gets to a point where we have these types of problems. And one of the interesting things here that you're going to start hearing, we've already started hearing, and this has been something, quite honestly, in my opinion, from just reading things, we hear it more from the right than we do the left, of the conspiracy theories behind. I mean, I've heard all the stuff about conspiracy theories behind the coronavirus and all this kind of stuff, but we're already starting to hear conspiracy theories about what happened. And so...
In terms of the storming of the Capitol or the election fraud?
No,
election
the storming of the Capitol. That there was a lot of things blown out of proportion and that it wasn't as bad as everybody thought it was and all this kind of stuff. Here's the deal.
There's a video.
Here's the deal. I think that if you're doing that, you're trying to, what's that called, put lipstick on a pig situation.
Yeah, I think
you're trying to downplay what just happened. It's also the same thing, and again, sharing my viewpoint, it's also the same thing as people trying to compare this to the Black Lives Matter protests, where nobody stormed the Capitol building. Nobody created insurrection over our government and took over or tried to bridge, the doors where our elected representatives are trying to certify an election.
Causing them to literally hide under their desks.
Right. Two totally different situations.
Yeah.
There was definitely some bad things that have happened with some of those protests that turned violent and turned into looters, all that kind of stuff. But trying to compare the two, I think, is an ignorant way to look at this, because I think you're missing the entire point that you just said a second ago. Our Capitol has not been overrun since 1776.
1814.
1814, sorry. And this is the first time this has happened. This is a totally different ballgame than protesting about a social movement.
Yeah, I mean, guys, it's been 206 years since the Capitol was overrun.
And, that's part of the reason that there will be criminal charges brought in the District of Columbia has been very clear that they're going to bring charges.
And they've already started.
They have.
They've already started bringing criminal charges, and people are already starting to be put on the no-fly list.
Right.
Because they're being charged, some of them, as domestic terrorists.
Right.
And I think that's a whole another very interesting area of law. And, now that I'm thinking about it, I have a friend who actually was a teacher of mine in high school who used to be part of the CIA and then the FBI and then worked in counterterrorism. So
I probably didn't know anything about any of this stuff. No experience.
Maybe if we're really, really nice, we can get her to come on and discuss the issue of domestic terrorism.
That would be interesting. I mean, we have to censor what we ask and things like that. But yes, that would be great. That would be great to have them on. And so the interesting thing too, I guess one thing I think we need to discuss as we get into this is the idea about the District of Columbia itself. Just because it's something that we forget about a lot of times.
And how it's not actually like a state.
It's not actually a state, but it's its own district. It functions that way. That's why there's a Capitol Police and there's all sorts of different entities like that. So you've got prosecutors in the District of Columbia that can prosecute based on laws in D.C. As well as we've got federal prosecutors that can prosecute for violation of federal laws. And so it functions kind of like a state and federal system as far as when you're prosecuting criminal offenses.
Yeah, so for example, in Texas, right, for our readers who maybe aren't so familiar with the criminal system or they've only seen
couple seasons of Law and Order.
I was like,
not all of them. They've seen all of them, they're probably good, but if they haven't seen a couple of them, they may need some backup.
Yeah, sure. So, you've got the state level, right? So you've got the district attorney and the assistant district attorneys, and they're going to be the ones who are prosecuting state issues at the state level. And usually, too, it's not a municipal level. It's like a town area.
County.
It's county. Thank you.
It's county level, and they're usually the typical. Best examples I think of is usually when you're dealing with things like DWI, murder, assault, your typical crimes that most people think of. Those are usually theft. Those are usually state crimes, typically. They can be federal, but on the whole, most of the time, you get pulled over for DWI, someone murders somebody in Dallas, the Dallas County District Attorney is going to prosecute that crime.
Versus federal crimes, right? So then you have federal court, and I call it big boy court, right?
Yeah. Well, I mean, that's an accurate statement because it's a whole different level.
Yeah, and literally, the courtrooms in the federal court here in Dallas are 2-3 stories tall. I mean, they're beautiful and they're huge, but they're huge.
Right.
Probably 3 times the size of a Dallas state courtroom. And the crimes that you're going to have there are, for example, my federal criminal case that I did was a white collar one. It was healthcare fraud.
Right.
And aggravated identity theft. And so these are issues that are federal in nature. They cross state lines oftentimes, but they're not going to be something that a state is not appropriate for a state to handle.
Exactly. And it's so you hit the nail right on the head there. You've got either you violated a federal statute, such as a healthcare fraud, maybe you've violated Medicare statute, and how payouts are made or something like that.
Which
That's
is
a federal
really,
law.
really bad. Don't do it.
It is. Or you violate what could be a state crime, but it has some kind of a hook. Either you cross state lines, like you said, or it's such a big crime that it affects multiple states. We usually call that the interstate commerce idea. It's usually the best way I explain it.
So child pornography would be an example. Child pornography crossing state lines is, well, I guess at this point it doesn't even need to have to cross state lines because of cell phones.
Internet and everything
could.
like that. Right.
Yeah.
Right. And so drug trafficking is one we see a lot.
That's a great example of drug trafficking.
So, and something that crosses international borders. So, for example, anything related to the cartel, if you've got gun running or drug running going down to Mexico.
Or running girls.
Human trafficking. That was an example. It's a great example of something that's going to land you in federal court.
Yeah.
So, situation we have here is we can have certain laws, and we're going to get into some of the specifics, but you can violate a law in the District of Columbia, which is going to probably be more akin to like a state law like we were talking about, but then also committing crimes against the federal government itself, stealing federal government property. We're going to talk about treason and sedition here in a little bit, which is kind of fun because you don't get to talk about that very often.
That's a sexy topic, you know?
It is. I mean, because it makes you think of like 1776, you know? I mean, back in the day. Those are going to be federal crimes because they are federal laws that you are violating, or it's federal property, those types of deals.
And I think one thing that is important to note too is that, going back to what you said about the DC laws that were violated, right, and how they're akin to state laws, I think it's also important for people to realize before they get their panties in a bunch and start screaming like, how can you be arrested for having a firearm? Like, you're depriving me of my right to bear arms. That wouldn't have happened in Texas. You're right. It probably wouldn't have happened in Texas because Texas state laws as to guns are much different than those laws in DC.
Right.
And so, you need to be aware of what your applicable rights are and what the applicable laws are if you're going to be carrying guns somewhere.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that also in that same light, people are going to say, well, I was exercising my First Amendment right. How can I, commit a crime?
There are limits on that.
There's big limits on that. We're going to talk about next week.
Limits.
And that's not going to slow any prosecutor down from prosecuting for these crimes that were committed. So let's jump into the first one. You were just talking about guns, and that's actually exactly where I wanted to go.
There we go.
We got firearm-related issues. And one of the big deals is, first, there are federal laws against carrying a firearm in a federal building. Right. And it makes sense. You can't, that's like example, you go into the federal courthouse in Dallas. So this could happen even in your own city.
Yeah, it can.
You go into the federal courthouse, you go through the metal detectors, and actually, you were talking about it being big boy court. At federal courthouse, as you know, but for our listeners, you don't just go through a metal detector to get in. Yeah. Then you go to the floor where you're supposed to go see your judge. You go through another metal detector.
Another metal detector. Okay, and you've already had your bags x-rayed at the first one. And I learned very quickly, ladies, if you're ever going to federal court, Tom's shoes, they're great. They have no metal in them. Because otherwise, you know what happens? You know what happened to me my first day there? I was so embarrassed. I was wearing high heels, right? Because I was going to be in court.
Right.
I had to take off my high heels and run them through another scanner and walk through another metal detector because my high heels were setting off the metal detector. And I was like, look, I'm an attorney. I'm in heels. Like, I'm in a skirt suit. I literally can't even be hiding anything. And they're like, nope, shoes through the metal detector.
Yeah.
And so they also literally won't let you take in electronics unless you're an attorney, show your bar card, and you can then bring in your cell phone or your laptop.
Yeah, I was about to say that you can't bring cell phone, laptop unless you're, we've even had issues with expert witnesses before being able to bring in their computers for testimony.
Yeah, I had a colleague of mine, it was during that same healthcare fraud case, and the paralegal that she had that was operating the presentation for her, I believe it was either opening and closing statement, needed to bring an extra laptop. And so security was giving her a hassle about it. And so finally the attorney, my colleague, just took the laptop. She's like, I have 2 laptops.
Yeah.
So what you can do?
For me, I always wear cowboy boots to court, so I just slip them off, throw them through there, put them back on. No big deal.
Yeah, and you have socks on. It's not like you're walking barefoot like
That's
I was.
It changes the game a little bit too on that. So no firearms in the Capitol building. Makes a lot of sense. Now, here's the part that I think people are going to get real up in arms about. You just mentioned it a second ago. The right to bear arms, Second Amendment, Texas law versus DC law. Well, in Texas, we do have the unauthorized possession of a firearm or unauthorized use of a weapon, unauthorized possession of a firearm. They have those similar laws in DC. So one of the big ones they're looking at is possession of an unregistered firearm in the District of Columbia. Yeah. So I'm going to steal a line from one of my favorite movies, Tombstone. They're basically saying, we're not saying you can't own a gun, not saying you can't carry a gun, you just can't carry a gun in town.
Yeah.
Well, the whole point is you either got to have it registered or you can't carry it at the Capitol building. That's against the law. And so people that want to say that that if someone's being prosecuted for having a gun on them during this mob mentality situation, that's a violation of their Second Amendment.
It's not. They're
missing the point. And that's, unfortunately, I think we're going to hear a lot of that.
I think we will. And I think there will be a lot of people who are going to be taking to Twitter, unless their accounts get frozen and so on and so forth, and just lambasting, saying my rights are being violated, my constitutional rights are being taken away from me. No, they're not. And I think that's something that I really want to impress upon people, right, with today's episode and the next week's episode, is that, yes, y'all do have constitutional rights. There are limits.
Yes.
There are big time limits on those rights. And I think a lot of people just think, oh, I have the right to free speech. I have the right to bear arms. I have the right to assemble and picket and protest. Yeah, within reason.
Yeah.
Now, granted, some rights are more broadly permissible than others.
Yeah.
But there are still limits even on free speech.
There is. Well, and let's flip the script a little bit. I don't want to get too far off topic, but let's look at even your right against unreasonable search and seizure.
Yeah.
You have a right to a certain extent, but then the Supreme Court and mainly the Supreme Court has put limits on what that right is, and it's allowed police officers. It's balanced the idea of officers maintaining public safety, investigating crime versus our individual rights, and it put limits on that too. And so even if you flip the script and say, well, you still have those rights too, but they're also limited. So it's across the board with all of our Bill of Rights and all the amendments that have been put into place.
And I think one of the things too that's kind of a theme, right, in the limitation of a lot of these rights is that the limitation is put on there in order to maintain safety and order.
Yeah.
And we'll see that again with the free speech episode later. But, even here we're seeing that with the search and seizure, it's there to maintain safety and order, right? You don't want someone whipping out a Molotov cocktail out of their blazer and chucking it at a police officer during a search and seizure stop if they can clearly see something like bulging underneath the jacket that looks like a Molotov cocktail.
Sure. Well, just look at this exact example. You have the right to bear arms, and there's a debate all over that thing. And we probably eventually will do an episode over the Second Amendment because it's worth having.
It was actually, I think, wasn't it the last amendment to be brought over and incorporated and made applicable to the states?
I don't know. For that episode, we ought to look that up.
I'll look that up. I think it might be, but I will look it up.
But even with this amendment, okay, you have the right to possess a firearm under certain circumstances. That's why we have gun registration laws, which people disagree with. That's why you can't carry it to the Capitol building. You can't carry it into a courthouse. I mean, lawyers can't carry it in a courthouse.
No.
The bailiffs and the sheriffs can. Now there is a standing law in Texas. I don't know if you know this, Andrea. Judges are allowed to sit on the bench strapped. They're allowed to have a firearm.
Yeah. I'm sorry you said that word. I'm like, excuse me?
Well, I'm doing the motion, but they're allowed to carry a firearm while sitting on the bench.
I actually did not know that.
And there are some judges, and I won't name names, but I know for a fact that they love to exercise that right. Because they like to talk about it.
Oh, how interesting.
When they're in kind of a colloquial conversation, they like to kind of discuss that. It's usually in some of the more rural counties, as you could probably imagine.
I see.
But judges are allowed to carry a weapon with them on the bench, which in the 1800s probably made a lot more sense maybe than now. But even so, here we are.
Here we are.
So people are going to be prosecuted for having unregistered firearms, for carrying firearms in the Capitol building if they were caught. Now, I have heard, this is not confirmed, and candidly, another personal view of mine, there's a lot of stuff I read in the news that I don't really count as confirmed anymore any longer. I think there's been a lot of issues with journalistic credibility in the last 5 years or so. But I've heard that there were other weapons found on people like restraints and knives. I mean, knives make sense, but I've heard that there was some like what you would consider kidnapping type restraints and like handcuffs, things like that.
Zip ties. I did read, I think on like ABC News, I was reading more than I was reading everything last night. ABC, Fox, Politico, Skim, everything.
TMZ, yeah.
TMZ, that's my favorite.
But I've heard we've had some of that there too. And so those I don't know if you can class, they're definitely not firearms, but there could be some other conspiracy or attempt to kidnap things that are thrown in there
and I think
that may not stick, but they may
But I
be
think
thrown
that's
in.
important, right? So for example, carrying zip ties that are frequently used, to kidnap people. Like, for example, if you kidnap someone for trafficking of little girls because you're a sick human being, and those are the zip ties that are normally used, and you're found carrying those in the Capitol building, that's a piece of evidence that's circumstantial evidence that could be used against you in, say, conspiracy to commit a kidnapping of a senator or a House rep.
Right.
So I'm just saying be mindful.
Absolutely.
Maybe don't carry those.
Right. So the next, and this is one of the more obvious ones coming straight from firearms, is assault charges.
Yeah.
And assault, very simple. You actually connect with somebody with the intent to harm them.
And we're talking criminal assault here.
Right.
Because there's a difference, y'all, in the terms of assault between civil and criminal, at least in Texas.
Right. Well, and that's actually good to illustrate, and I don't know the DC specific elements of everything. Either. But in Texas, civil assault, I'll let you kind of walk us through that.
Sure. I mean, at the end of the day, civil assault is that you just have to put someone, so John is big, bad, scary, and then he's walking up to Linda, and he's been abusive to Linda before, and he's brandishing a knife at her, and he's running at her, crazy eyes, screaming, I'm going to cut your throat, I'm going to cut your throat. And Linda is, and here are the magic words, in imminent fear of physical harm from John.
Yeah.
And that's the critical part. Now, maybe he stops and all of a sudden he's like, oh, actually the voices in my head told me not to kill you. Have a nice day, bye. And I hope he gets help because maybe it sounds like he has some sort of mental issue. So I hope John gets help and Linda's okay. But at the end of the day, even though Linda wasn't knifed, right, she was in physical fear of, she was in fear of imminent physical harm, right? Because she was about to get knifed in like 1.2 seconds.
Right.
Before the voices in John's head told him to walk away. And so that would constitute assault, right? You don't have to actually be hurt. You just have to be afraid, very afraid that you're about to like momentarily be physically hurt, which is different than battery.
Right, exactly. And that's a civil difference. Yeah. So like civilly, Linda would have the ability to sue John, potentially get money for the pain, suffering, mental anguish, whatever it is that happened there, even though he didn't actually contact her.
Correct. Now, if he did go ahead and knife her, now she would have battery charges because he made physical contact with her physical being.
Right. And we, at that point, would have a criminal charge as well.
We would.
And so that's the difference, like you were kind of insinuating there, is that assault on a criminal side, at least here in Texas, there has to actually be contact of the person. For there needs to be an intent to contact the person to cause harm. And now, just as a little side note for our listeners, if John had done that, what I've seen that classified a lot as, that can be classified as a terroristic threat in Texas.
Oh, interesting.
So
I haven't really seen that.
It's a very broad statement. There's been plenty of cases I've worked on, not plenty, there's been a handful of cases that I've worked on that they've classified something as a terroristic threat, and I have to kind of scratch my head because I'm like, guys, I don't know. I think we're stretching.
A terroristic threat. I mean, when you say terrorism, I think like 9/11 or pipe bombs.
They're using it in Texas as a very broad application. Basically, anyone who makes a threat of harm to somebody.
Oh, okay. So literally putting someone in a state of terror.
That's exactly what it is, and it hasn't been constitutionally challenged because it's a pretty low-level misdemeanor. So it's just one of those things.
The word does not make me think of a low-level misdemeanor. It makes me think of a massive federal offense.
Right, exactly, and that's not what it is in Texas. So
interesting.
Maybe different other places, but assault here, we can see both DC and federal charges brought because you've got assault of humans, so just in general, DC could bring charges, but assault of federal law enforcement officers, that changes the game because it's a federal officer, it's a federal statute, and therefore you've got issues. And I know here in Texas, I'm sure it's the same way with these statutes. You've got assault, and then you can have enhancements on an assault charge.
Yes, and we've discussed enhancements before in, I can't remember which episode it was.
Probably Criminal 101. It's probably the
Criminal 101, and then also we discussed
hate crimes.
In the hate crimes episode, because hate crime is an enhancement.
Right. And so, basically the idea is you got your base level crime, excuse me, if there are things that make it worse, that enhances the severity of the crime, therefore enhances the range of consequences. And there are
certain actions or certain facts present that are critical or necessary for the enhancement to be triggered, right? You can't not everything that makes crime worse is an enhancement. It has to be basically statutorily laid out.
Exactly. It's going to be written in the law so that it's very clear, because what happens is procedurally, you get charged with this assault, and then some of the enhancements with assault are with a deadly weapon.
And what's an example of that?
A gun.
Okay.
Very easy. Easy.
Yeah.
I mean, really, honestly.
I was throwing you a softball, Austin.
No, I appreciate. Well, and the thing is, it can be a lot of different things. I mean,
what about a pipe?
Yes, I was going to say pipe, tire iron, baseball bat, anything that you use.
What about a stiletto?
If you use it in that way.
Like a stiletto to the temple?
Yeah, if you're using the way that I kind of think of it, and this is Austin's paraphrase. This isn't out of law book.
I sense a new side series for our IGTV.
There you go.
Austin's paraphrasing. And Andrea's injections of
that's
commentary.
Perfect, yeah. So basically any tangible item that you try to use to harm somebody, that can be a deadly weapon.
So if I'm not going to do this because I don't want to get
not doing that.
hit. But if this is someone's like temple right here and someone was doing that, assault a deadly weapon?
Yeah, I mean, that could classify. I mean, honestly, you could take my football here and potentially turn that into a deadly weapon.
Interesting. And so for our listeners,
it'd be a harder argument.
Yeah, for our listeners who don't see the YouTube portion of this, I just tapped my high heel against the side of my fist.
Yeah.
So pretending the fist was like the temple person.
Right. So deadly weapon is an enhancement, and a peace officer, i.e. a law enforcement officer, if the assault is on someone like him or her, that's an enhancement as well, which makes sense. They're there to protect and serve. You should be punished more severely if you assault that person. Yeah. And so I think we're going to see some of that, and we're going to get into some of the evidence and how we think they'll prove some of this here in a little bit.
Yeah, I find it very interesting.
One of the ones I kind of laugh at this because it's obvious, but could potentially be controversial is trespass.
Oh yeah.
Because so trespass, people just think of trespass about. Well, they think about it certain ways. You got a no trespassing sign, all this kind of stuff. I think one of the ways that it probably applies here is that, okay, well, yeah, it's a public building. Visitors are welcome sometimes. But the difference is you can be somewhere and then all of a sudden be not wanted anymore, not welcome, and then still be trespassing, right?
Yeah.
So that's kind of what we have here is the mobsters, the mob.
They're not Al Capone.
the rioters, whatever you want to call it.
Sure.
They were definitely not welcome in the Capitol building at that time.
Especially when we have an electoral college count going on.
Right. Maybe if they'd taken a normal tour, okay, no trespassing, you're welcome to do that.
They're allowed in. It's like, welcome to the premises.
Yeah, and that's the interesting thing about trespass is that you can, at one point in time, be a non-trespasser and then become a trespasser when you're no longer welcome.
The status changes like that.
Yeah, and it can also change by your conduct. Actually, you can have a trespass situation in a bar where all of a sudden they're trying to kick you out because you've become unruly, and then at that point you are now a trespasser because you are no longer wanted to be there.
So if Margot is at a bar and then all of a sudden she jumps up on the bar and starts flinging around shots and yelling shots, 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 and starts smacking people in the head with shot glasses, she would be a trespasser at that point.
She could be. She could be if she was kicked out, and usually the easier way to prove that is she's kicked out and then she somehow sneaks her way back in. That's usually prosecutors usually are going to probably focus on destruction of property and any bodily harm versus trespass because it is such a minor criminal offense. But if she gets kicked out and then sneaks her way back in through the kitchen door or something,
and then hops back on the bar,
then we probably have a trespass charge.
Shots everywhere. Yeah, okay.
So one of the bigger ones. I want to talk about this, and then we need to get to sedition and treason because those are the fun ones. But murder and manslaughter. Obviously, we talked about the deaths, and I think people will understand generally what murder and manslaughter is. Obviously, the intent.
Why don't you explain the difference really quick? Because I do think that some people are confused between the difference of murder and manslaughter. Because at the end of the day, someone's still dead.
Yes. So in general, when someone dies, that's called a homicide. So
if someone dies of non-natural causes.
Correct. So if someone dies, of non-natural causes or it's not a suicide, criminally, when they investigate it, it's a homicide. You've got different degrees of that. You got murder and manslaughter, the two we'll talk about here, as well as the felony murder rule. But the difference between murder and manslaughter is the mental intent. Yeah. Now, this is not premeditation. There may be some jurisdictions where that's an element, but premeditation is not a thing in Texas.
Yeah, we got rid of that.
That's a law and order deal. But if you intend to harm somebody, and use such force that it's reasonably foreseeable that they could die, that's murder. Now, if you conduct yourself recklessly, sometimes that's why we have involuntary manslaughter, vehicular manslaughter, when someone drives drunk and kills somebody in a vehicle. They didn't drive in with the intent to kill somebody, but they were reckless by getting behind the wheel, intoxicated.
And I think one really, I say funny, odd, colorful example is if you have Jenny and Johnny on top of a freeway overpass and they're starting to lob massive pumpkins at people driving under the underpass, well, these pumpkins are like 15, 20 pounds. They're being reckless with the safety of these drivers because it is very possible, and either they knew or they reasonably should have known, right, that these pumpkins could crash the windshields and then hurt the driver and cause there to be an accident and then cause that person to either be injured or die.
Right.
And so that would be, if someone died from that, that would be an example of recklessness that led to manslaughter charges.
Right. So that's the difference between murder and manslaughter. Now, the felony murder rule is something that's interesting, and there's actually quite a few people talking about it in terms of this situation
and
right
I think
now.
the felony murder rule people get very confused about.
They do. And honestly, it's a little bit of an abstract concept.
It is.
It's not as tight-knit as, okay, I intended to hurt the person. I hurt them in a way that was very dangerous. They died. Okay, that's murder. Got it. I was reckless. They died. Okay, I got it. Felony murder rule is basically you are committing a felony. You intend to commit a felony that is clearly dangerous to human life.
Yeah.
And so armed robbery that turns into say that you go rob a convenience store. This is one of the best examples. And they don't shoot the store clerk, but they end up driving away. And this is actually one that sometimes gets people riled up. Two guys get in the car, drive away, getaway car, and get in a car wreck. One of the robbers dies. Well, the driver can actually be charged and convicted of felony murder because he committed a felony, which is armed robbery. He was then driving away from the scene of the crime, got in a car wreck, his partner dies. That's felony murder.
Yeah.
And then there's other things like, okay, say that you kidnap somebody and the person dies under your watch even though you didn't intend to kill them.
Yeah.
That's felony murder because you took an act.
Or, for example, right, if someone else commits the kidnapping and you were there just as the lookout, and then on the way to the safe house where the kidnappers were going to take the kidnapped, little girl, for example, if the little girl dies, then the person who was the lookout would also be charged with felony murder, would he not?
They could, and they can be charged as an accessory of some sort. There may be a different degree in which how they get in, how they get there with conspiracy. So that's still there, still the idea. And that's actually a good point, and I need to illustrate this while we talk about this, is that there's a lot of times where you've got a criminal offense, you can charge multiple people for the conspiracy to commit a certain offense. Now, big deal about that is you've got to have a meeting of the minds between the two people. That means that two people have to agree we're going to take this action, then we have to take this action that fulfills the conspiracy part, and then if this action then leads to something that fulfills the felony murder rule, well then we can round up these people and all charge them. Here, we've got people that are, we talked about some of the felonies that are here.
Sure.
Possessing a firearm in the Capitol building.
Assault of a police officer.
Assault of a police officer. You could see, and people are throwing this around, and I know prosecutors are going to be very vigilant about this. We could see some of these people charged with felony murder or conspiracy to commit felony murder because of the deaths that happened.
Yeah.
Now, the conspiracy side is going to be hard because you've got a mob mentality. You've got a bunch of people that probably didn't meet up beforehand, sit down, have a meeting over coffee to discuss how they're going to get into the Capitol building and kill people.
But let me throw a wrench into this, right? We discussed earlier how allegedly we heard that there were zip ties found, right? So zip tie handcuffs that were found. And then I also heard that, and this might not have been on the Capitol complex grounds, this may have been outside the complex grounds, but there were also allegedly pipe bombs and Molotov cocktails.
Heard about that too.
Okay, so if you take all of this together, could that be used then to create a case of conspiracy to commit murder?
It could if you can connect multiple people to the manufacturer, placement, and transport of those items. Because the idea, one of the big components of a conspiracy is not just that you guys made a decision together and made an agreement, you took a concerted action after that in furtherance of that agreement. So we agreed to descend upon the Capitol and wreak havoc, cause violence. You don't even necessarily have to be that specific about it. We wanted to create violence. We then made a pipe bomb, put it in a backpack and took it with us. We then put zip ties in a backpack. We then put a firearm on our hip. And then we went to the Capitol. Okay, now we're starting to get to the point where we've got a conspiracy and we may be able to round these people up and charge them with felony murder. So it's interesting. And one of the things that'll happen with this is, you mentioned this at the beginning of the show, or when we talked about the deaths, there were some people that died due to pre-existing conditions, maybe just...
That's my understanding.
Right.
I haven't thoroughly fact-checked yet, but I was reading an excerpt from the police report, and I believe the term that I was reading was death by independent causes. So causes aside from the riot, i.e. someone wasn't shot in the chest like that woman that we were discussing. Right. My sister told me someone accidentally tased himself to death.
Sorry, I shouldn't laugh, but...
He was allegedly, she said she saw it where he was attempting to like steal a portrait or something, and then he put the taser between his knees, and then it tased, and he wasn't able, I guess the muscles constricted, and he couldn't let go, and so it kept tasing him, and then he eventually died from it. Now, I have not fact-checked that. Sure. I don't know if it's true, but that's what she told me.
Sure. But hypothetically, let's just take the, anytime there's an independent, like superseding, intervening cause that interrupts the felony committed and then the murder or the death that happened, doesn't always kill it. Excuse me, that's a bad term there. It doesn't always cut the connection off. So you can still have someone charged and convicted of felony murder even when there's some intervening cause. It's all fact specific. And so I think you're going to see some of those deaths were caused by either pre-existing health conditions or something else. That may cut the ties or it may not. I don't know.
So I think a good example then would be if you are going into the building, you're storming the Capitol, and then someone already has I don't know what you would call it medically, but a tendency towards heart attacks, right? So the person goes in and there's just so much excitement, and I apologize, so I'm butchering the medical situation here, but then they just have a heart attack and die from the sheer excitement and fear of, riot police in the building. Would that heart attack then be considered possibly a superseding and intervening cause that would then cut any potential conspiracy case?
Potentially. So I think maybe if let's make the person that has the heart disease condition one of the officers. That's the Capitol Police officers.
Oh, okay. Let's make it very interesting.
You assault the officer on your way into the Capitol building, and then he or she, well, let's say he goes to the hospital and dies 6-8 days later.
And when you say assault, like, are we saying, punch the person or just shove them?
Say he shoves them as he's barreling
Shoves
through
them out of the way. The
yeah.
officer stumbles back a few steps and then stands up straight and misses the guy as he runs by.
Yeah.
So it doesn't fall, doesn't hit his head, nothing. Just stumbles a few steps.
In this situation, it's not going to surprise me if they get charged with felony murder if that officer were to suffer a heart attack later that day and then go, because it just seems to me they're going to be very aggressive with how they charge the people involved with this.
Sure.
So will the charges stick? Don't know. We'll see. But I think that you're going to see a lot of aggressive charges, and they got to balance that with, if you charge too aggressively, you may not get the charges to stick, all that kind of stuff. But I think they're going to send a message with how they prosecute these crimes. And especially when we get into sedition and treason.
Here we go.
And these are crimes. So treason is the only criminal offense that's actually listed in the Constitution.
It's a big deal.
It's the only one that's listed there. All the rest of them are laws that are promulgated by our legislature and enforced by our executive branch. But the deal about treason, the reason treason is hard to actually prove and we don't hear it very often is that it requires concrete action, like actual steps of levying war against the United States or giving American enemies aid. And so talking about it doesn't get you there. Making plans doesn't really get you there unless there's actual, you start purchasing bomb materials or things like that. It's the idea of either stealing confidential information, giving it to American enemies, or actually taking steps to overthrow the U.S. government.
So, for
or
example,
levy war, not overthrow, levy war.
So then I think maybe an example for treason, and then step in and correct me if my hypothetical is going off base. If you have a person who comes here and they are from China, and that person comes here and they obtain their work visa, and they're working for, I don't know, a defense contractor, Lockheed Martin, on some fighter jets. And then it turns out that years later that this person who had to get a security clearance has been turning around and giving classified information about these fighter jets that he is working on at Lockheed Martin to the Chinese government. Would that constitute treason?
Yes.
Okay. So that's a very clear example.
Very clear example of it. Another example, the Civil War. The Confederate States levied war against the Union. That was treason. Now, got treated differently. Obviously, that was part of the surrender and all that kind of stuff. But that's an idea of actually levying war. That you're not going to see that unless we actually have a militia rise up and try to...
Yeah, I was about to say, I think that's probably... I like my Chinese example.
Well, I'm just trying to give a levying war example that you're going to have to see a militia rise up to actually fight the U.S. government.
So if a Texas militia came up and said, "Hey, Texas is over this piece, y'all out, we're seceding."
Yeah, then we've got treason. Treason.
Yeah, now, but I don't think that's going to happen.
Yeah, no, I don't either. Now, sedition is different. Sedition is easier to prove, easier to charge. It is any unlawful attempt to conspire to overthrow, put down, or destroy the government by force. That we're going to see some of that here. We're absolutely going to see some of that here because storming the Capitol building with weapons, stopping the governmental process, That's not free speech, obviously.
No, that is not free speech. It is not protected.
It actually could get to the level of sedition. Now, the interesting thing that I noticed too, when you look at this, treason is punishable by up to 5 years and a $10,000 fine, which I thought was pretty light. Sedition is punishable by up to 20 years, and there's not a actual limit put on the fine. So it's punishable a lot more seriously. And I don't know the reason for that. Maybe it's because treason doesn't get looked at that often.
And maybe so. And it seems also that treason almost would be, not treason, excuse me, sedition almost seems easier or more easy to prove.
It is, yeah. Well, because you don't have to have that concrete action. It's the unlawful conspiracy of trying to do these things. And so that's one of the things that a lot of prosecutors are throwing around, that they're saying that they're going to charge on the federal level, because it is a federal crime. They're going to charge some of these people with, because of their concerted efforts to storm the Capitol building and throw off our certification process. And, this is a very 2021 type way of looking at all these things, because the evidence that's going to be used, interestingly enough, is going to be social media posts. It's going to be pictures. It's going to be live stream videos. Well, formerly live stream videos. Yeah. It's going to be all that type of data where they can pinpoint people. They can look at pictures to see weapons. They can identify people.
They can geotag people.
They can, right? All that type of stuff. That's going to be very interesting to see how they ferry that out, because it's there.
And I think it's also critical for people to understand, because again, everyone hears the concept of hearsay and they're like, oh, this I didn't say that in court. That's hearsay. Can't get in. Well, no, hearsay is a lot more complicated than I think a lot of people realize. Right. And it's actually, so long as they're relevant, it's actually pretty easy to get Instagram posts or IGTV or Facebook Lives that have been recorded into evidence. It's not that difficult. And lawyers have been doing it for quite some time. I have done it multiple times at various different trials. And sometimes those social media posts are the crux of my evidence. Absolutely. And they've worked for me.
Well, and going into something that you talked about earlier is, we were discussing earlier about what type of circumstantial evidence are they going to potentially use to prove conspiracy, prove that the plan was made. Well, Twitter is a unforgiving place where you can find a lot of statements made, and if you got somebody who is being charged with one of these crimes, and they were sending something out on Twitter, that definitely a statement that will be used against them in court. They weren't arrested and Mirandized yet, because that wasn't relevant. And you were talking about hearsay. That's actually not hearsay if you're the one charged, because one of the it's not even an exception. It's just if you it's carve out. If you are a party to the suit or the criminal action, and there's a statement that you made yourself, well, it's a carve out. It's not hearsay.
And it's relevant to the matter.
And it's relevant to the matter. So if you tweeted out something that was a threat to the U.S. government, and then you were one of the ones caught with a firearm in the Capitol building, well, that tweet is going to be used against you. Absolutely. And it's going to hurt you quite a bit, and you can't keep it out of evidence, most likely.
And I think it's really important, everything you put on social media, it's accessible, right? Yeah. It is very accessible. Just because you have something on private does not mean it's safe. And so if someone is posting pictures of them bare-chested in a man, hopefully not a woman, with like a cape on, holding a knife and a noose saying, we're going to knife and hang Mike Pence, and you're posting pictures of that on Instagram, and then you're posting more pictures saying, I've got these zip ties, I'm going to kidnap Pelosi, and this and that. Well, y'all, maybe you were just thinking, oh, that's just free speech. It's not free speech, and that actually can be used as evidence against you to say that you were part of a conspiracy to commit murder, a conspiracy to commit kidnapping. I mean, these are all things that can be used against you. So be very careful with what you post on social media, because it can come back to haunt you. And you know what? When you see those photos, the jury sees those photos, the jury sees those captions, and you're sitting there, you're like, well, that wasn't my intent. I didn't actually mean we should hang Mike Pence. I meant it metaphorically. Yeah. Well, now that's something that's just not very convincing now, is it?
Well, and part of the problem is, if you have a statement like that, the prosecution is allowed to get that in. Well, the only way you can refute that is if you take the stand, and in most criminal trials, it's usually advisable not as the defendant to take the stand.
Fifth Amendment.
Yeah, to not take the stand, because it's just easy to get tripped up on cross-examination. So
very easy.
Not to get in the weeds on the procedure, but you end up with a decision of, well, do I go up there and defend that tweet and then potentially expose myself to getting just slaughtered on the stand by the prosecutor in the cross-examination process, or do I just try to let my lawyer dance around it? Now, as far as pictures and stuff are concerned, I got to say this. I hope that at some point, that picture of the guy with the skin, the man bear pig, like horns coming out that.
Yeah, the American Thor wannabe.
Yeah. That's probably not going to bode well if he gets charged.
No, I don't think so. I mean, sorry, buddy.
I've loved the amount of people that have been making fun of that on podcasts. And also, I mean, I listen to sports podcasts and people are referencing it, saying that, hey, well, look, things are going a little crazy. The leader of our Senate the other day was wearing an animal skin over his head. So, I don't know what we're going to do here. So as we close this out, I think it would be this was a Matt idea, and I think Matt nailed it. Mm-hmm. Talking about 3 different scenarios of, okay, how would different protesters potentially be charged or treated differently in these certain scenarios? So we'll start with the most extreme, which would be, let's start with the least extreme. Mm-hmm. Protester who showed up, like your friends were talking about doing. Like, actually, there's a couple of my friends that were out there as well.
Yes, one of our mutual friends I saw on his Instagram post. Too, He's out there. Hey, buddy.
Actually was like, hey, man, are you okay? Are you safe?
Yeah.
Anyways, and he was. A protester who shows up, protest on the Hill, doesn't actually enter the building, exercising their First Amendment rights.
That's fine.
They're not going to face any criminal charges. No. They're not going to get looped in with all the other thousands of people.
And let's make it even better. They were standing on the street, which is public, right? Public access. There's no trespass situation on a public road.
Right.
With their sign saying object.
Right.
They're fine.
They're totally fine. Totally fine. Now, protester who enters the building without being forcibly held back by police officers. So we've heard, there's been some stories and maybe some videos, I haven't seen them, where officers let people through.
I haven't seen those either, but
doesn't really matter reason why, whatever. But say the officer lets somebody through, they storm in and they get looped in with everybody. Mm-hmm. Does the fact that the officer stepped out of the way make a difference whether they were trespassing or not? I would say no. Because at the same time, they're not allowed to be in the building at that point.
Yeah, so there would still be a trespass situation.
There'd still be a trespass situation because it doesn't require, you can trespass without breaking and entering or using force or anything like that.
Trespass is merely being somewhere where you're not permitted to be.
Right. So the fact that some of these officers may have let people through, okay, maybe there's an issue there that the Capitol Police internally need to deal with. Has nothing to do with whether somebody committed trespass or not, because they were still not legally allowed to be there. And then let's say that you've got a protester who enters the building. Let's say they forcibly, sorry, let me back up.
Yeah, make it a cleaner example, shall we?
They enter the building, no use of force. They just kind of follow the crowd in. And then they look around and they're like, what the hell is going on here? I need to leave.
Yeah, this is a bad idea.
And then they leave.
Peacefully leave.
Peacefully, don't assault anybody, don't have a firearm. At that point, you got a gray area. Because, they trespassed for a second, which they did commit the crime. Candidly, they're probably not going to get prosecuted.
What's the damage there?
There's no damage, but again, criminal liability doesn't matter whether there's damage or not.
No, that's true. Yeah, I'm still thinking from a civil mindset.
Right. So, but criminal guilt, I guess we would say. But likelihood, prosecutors probably not going to charge them. They got bigger fish to fry in this scenario. They're probably going to give them a little bit of benefit of the doubt, which is something like if I was the defense attorney in that situation, I would say, all right, look, I get it. They crossed the invisible red line. They weren't supposed to, but come on, they didn't steal anything.
They didn't steal Speaker Pelosi's podium.
They didn't go stand on anybody's desk. They didn't hurt anybody. Why don't y'all focus on some other people? Here, actually, I'll let him rat out these other people. Why don't you use them as a witness?
There you go.
But anyway, so those are just some of the scenarios we thought we should discuss a little bit. There's a lot more to this story.
There's so much more. We could spend like a month discussing all of these things.
And candidly, I think the First Amendment discussion next week is going to be extremely interesting because it's just, there's so many far-reaching implications.
Absolutely.
And there's actually a lot of jurisprudence over the course of time.
Yeah, quite a bit, actually.
that shows how limited or broad the First Amendment can get. So it'll be interesting to follow this as it goes on. I encourage all of our listeners to look at these, keep following these stories, see how these prosecutions end up. A lot of them will end up with plea deals, but those will be public knowledge. So it'll be interesting to see what they get charged with, what offenses and charges actually stick, what the consequences end up being. And I mean, let's be honest, it'll be interesting to see what type of public interest groups rise up in protest of these criminal charges.
And who's going to be filing amicus briefs?
Yes, all that kind of stuff. So it'll be interesting to see it unfold. In my opinion, sad day in our country's history.
Very sad.
And it's the idea of why there's limits to the First Amendment and why we still have to prosecute people who abuse those freedoms.
Right. It's good to be a patriot, y'all, but be a patriot in a way that's constitutionally protected.
Yeah, absolutely.
Be peaceful.
Well, guys, tune in next week. We've got part 2 of this episode. We're going to discuss the First Amendment. And stay tuned for closing arguments. We've got some interesting news on Bitcoin. Some of their biggest advocates are actually starting to lose faith in the coin itself.
Dun, dun, dun. Hey, y'all. Thank you so much for listening to Hashtag Lawyer Today. But wait, before you go, we want to make sure that you know where to find us on all the socials. So catch up with us on the audiovisual portion on YouTube. We have a Hashtag Lawyer channel there that we're very excited for you to take a look at if you want to put some faces to names. I know I love doing that. Make sure to follow us on our Instagrams, whether it be the Hashtag Lawyered Instagram or Austin's and my personal Instagrams. We check all three, so make sure to DM us or frankly leave comments on all of our latest posts to make sure that we're covering the topics that you guys are interested in. And if you have any questions or you're like, hey, I heard this in the news today, I think it's really interesting, I kind of want you and Austin to break it down for me and give the legal perspective so that I am well equipped at my next dinner party or Zoom cocktail hour, COVID and all that, to be able to discuss this with my friends. So again, thank you so much for listening. Make sure to rate and review the podcast on whatever platform that you're listening to. And we are so thankful that you're listening, and tune back in next week. Bye, y'all.
Today on Closing Argument, is Bitcoin finally losing some of its momentum? One of Bitcoin's early adopters, Stephen Thomas, actually has accumulated over $220 million worth of Bitcoin, but has forgotten his password to his wallet. So the way Bitcoin is set up is that you have a private wallet that's independent from any bank, any government institution. The problem is, you're the only one that controls it. So if you forget your password, you cannot access the money that's actually stored in that wallet. This has led not only Mr. Thomas, but many other users of Bitcoin to lose some faith in the currency and to really realize there's a reason we have bankers who bank for us, because we're probably not as good at this as we think we are. It'll be interesting to see how this unfolds and see if it actually impacts Bitcoin moving forward.